In her wedding speech, my daughter looked right at me and called me a pathetic failure. She smiled as she said it, basking in the applause from her wealthy new family. She had no idea her dead mother had left me one final weapon. A video message stored on a tiny USB drive in my pocket. A message that was about to burn her entire world to the ground. Before I tell you what was in that video, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And please hit like and subscribe if you believe that respect is earned, not bought. The Greystone Country Club wasn't just expensive, it was designed to make people feel small. Sunlight streamed through two-story windows, catching the dust motes dancing over floral arrangements that cost more than my first car. The air hummed with the polite, predatory chatter of old money and new ambition. I stood just inside the grand ballroom, a ghost in a well-made but hopelessly outdated suit. The other guests flowed around me like a river around a stone, their eyes sliding past me, registering nothing. I wasn't part of the scenery. I was just in the way. It was a feeling I had grown used to over the last few years, a quiet invisibility that had become my constant companion. But today, at my own daughter's wedding, it felt different, sharper. It felt like an intentional act of erasure. Then I saw her. Jessica, my daughter. She was a vision in white, a whirlwind of lace and diamonds, her face a perfect mask of bridal bliss. She swept towards me, her fiancé Chad, trailing in her wake like a prize stallion. I felt a flicker of hope, a foolish fatherly thought, that maybe just for today, things would be different. The hope died the moment she opened her mouth. "Dad," she said, her voice a tight whisper that barely concealed her irritation. She wasn't looking at my face, but at my suit. Her eyes scanned the lapels, the cut of the fabric, her perfectly painted lips curled into a faint sneer. "That suit, it's fine." The word fine was delivered with the same enthusiasm one might use for a piece of furniture you plan to replace. "Just maybe try to stay out of the main photographs." "Okay," the photographer knows to focus on our side of the family. She patted my arm, a gesture that was meant to look affectionate, but felt like a dismissal. She was already turning away, her attention captured by a wealthier, more important guest. Chad, my new son-in-law, offered me his hand. It was a limp, brief affair, his grip as weak as his smile. His eyes were already locked on his phone, scrolling through what I assumed were stock market updates. He hadn't said a single word to me. He didn't need to. His indifference was a language all its own. As they moved on, swallowed by the glittering crowd, Chad's mother, a woman named Beverly, whose face was pulled tight with surgery and superiority, drifted over. She glided to a stop in front of me, holding an empty glass. "Oh, there you are," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Could you be a dear and fetch me a glass of the Veuve Clicquot, not the Prosecco they're serving the lesser guests?" She smiled, a flash of blinding white veneers, and only then did her eyes truly focus on my face. A flicker of recognition followed by a wave of mortification. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, her hand flying to her chest. You're the father. I am so terribly sorry." Her apology was for her mistake, not for her assumption. I just nodded, unable to form words. She scurried away, leaving me alone again in the center of the room. I looked around at the sheer suffocating opulence of it all. The ice sculptures, the string quartet, the mountains of imported flowers. A bitter memory surfaced. Years ago, when my wife Clara was still alive, we had come to this very club for a charity dinner. Jessica, then a teenager, had been mesmerized. "One day," she had whispered, "I'm going to get married here." Clara had squeezed my hand. A few years later, after Clara got her diagnosis, I took a large portion of our savings, the money we had carefully put aside, and paid the initial deposit to reserve this venue for a future date. It was a promise to them both, a guarantee of a dream. But looking around now at a wedding that had been upgraded beyond all recognition, with sterling money, I knew my contribution, my sacrifice, was a forgotten footnote in a story Jessica was writing for herself. a story in which I no longer had a leading role. Later, I found my way to the bridal suite. The room was a storm of hairspray, frantic bridesmaids, and the pop of champagne corks. It smelled of perfume and anxiety. Jessica sat before a mirror framed with Hollywood lights, a team of artists making their final touches. She was beautiful, but her beauty had a hard, polished edge to it, like a marble statue. I waited quietly by the door, holding a small, worn, dark blue velvet box in my hand. When there was a lull in the chaos, I stepped forward. "Jessica," I said softly, "I have something for you." Her eyes met mine in the mirror, a flicker of annoyance in them. I opened the box. Inside, resting on faded silk, was a simple gold locket. It wasn't flashy. Its value was not in carats, but in memories. "It was your mother's," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "She wanted you to have it on your wedding day." Jessica turned, taking the box from my hand. She opened it, glanced at the locket for no more than a second, and gave a small, polite smile. "Oh," she said, "it's vintage." She said the word vintage as if it meant obsolete. "It's sweet, Dad, really, but it doesn't go with the Vera Wang at all. It would clash with the necklace Chad bought me." She gestured towards a string of diamonds already sparkling at her throat. Without another look, she placed the small blue box on the cluttered vanity table next to a large turquoise Tiffany box and a sleek black Chanel package. It was instantly lost in the sea of expensive, impersonal gifts. She then turned back to the mirror, her attention already focused back on her reflection, dismissing me and my gift in the same breath. I stood there for a moment, my hand still outstretched, as if I were still holding the box. I could see Clara so clearly in my mind, her warm hand fastening that very locket around her neck every morning. I remembered the day we had taken it to a jeweler to have a tiny photograph of 5-year-old Jessica, with her missing front tooth and pigtails carefully placed inside. For Jessica to treat it like a worthless trinket wasn't just an insult to me, it was a desecration of her mother's memory. It was the moment I realized that the daughter Clara and I had raised was truly gone, replaced by this cold, polished stranger who measured love in brand names. The ceremony itself was a blur. I walked Jessica down an aisle carpeted in white rose petals, my arm linked with hers, but I could have been a hired escort for all the connection I felt. I sat down on the front pew on the bride's side and was struck by the emptiness around me. Our family was small, and most of Clara's relatives had passed away or lived too far to travel. The single long pew where the bride's family was meant to sit held only me. Across the aisle, the groom's side was overflowing with dozens of loud, laughing, impeccably dressed sterlings. The visual was stark. I was an island of quiet solitude in an ocean of celebratory noise. And then, the whispers started. They came from the row behind me, from a pair of Chad's aunts dressed in coordinated pastel suits. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted to be heard. "That's her father, you know," one of them said, her voice sharp. "The retired school teacher." The other one made a soft, pitying sound. "I heard he barely has 2 nickels to rub together. Lives in the same tiny house they bought 40 years ago." The first one laughed a sound like cracking ice. "Well, isn't Jessica lucky? Chad is rescuing her from all that, giving her the life she deserves." Each word was a carefully aimed dart. They were confirming the narrative, the pathetic story my daughter had clearly been spinning for her new family. The story of a poor, simple father, a man to be pitied, and managed a relic from a life she was eager to escape. I sat there staring straight ahead at the altar, my back rigid. I didn't turn around. I didn't react. I just let the words wash over me, cementing a cold, hard resolve in my heart. The humiliation was no longer just a feeling. It was a fact. And it was not over yet. The clinking of glasses sounded like 1,000 tiny insistent bells, each one a signal of a joy I couldn't feel. The reception was in full swing, a performance of wealth so extravagant, it felt unreal. I sat at a table near the front, designated for the immediate family, though I felt more like a piece of misplaced furniture. The main event, the speeches, had begun. Chad's father, Richard Sterling, was the first to take the stage. He was a man who wore his success like a tailored suit, comfortable and custom-made. He held the microphone with an easy confidence, his voice booming through the ballroom. His speech was a masterclass in corporate-style sentimentality. He spoke of synergy of merging two great families of assets and futures. He praised his son's aggressive business instincts and Jessica's remarkable ability to adapt. Every word was a thinly veiled boast, a declaration of their dynasty's power. He talked about their recent trip to Monaco on their yacht, and how it reminded him of the importance of navigating the right waters in life. I watched Jessica as she listened, her face upturned, her eyes shining with adoration. She wasn't just marrying a man. She was marrying a brand, a lifestyle, a shield against the ordinary world I represented. She drank in his words of power and wealth, like a woman dying of thirst. I felt nothing but a quiet clinical detachment. I was an anthropologist observing the bizarre rituals of a foreign tribe. When Richard Sterling finished to thunderous applause, the MC announced my daughter. And now a few words from our beautiful bride, Jessica. Jessica rose from the head table and practically floated to the stage. She moved with a practiced grace, every gesture designed for an audience. She took the microphone, her diamond rings flashing under the spotlights. The room fell silent, captivated. She began, her voice a sweet, rehearsed melody. "Oh, wow," she breathed, placing a hand on her heart. "To see all of you here. It's just a dream. An absolute dream." She turned to her new husband first. "Chad, my rock, my soulmate. From the moment I met you, I knew my life was about to begin. You saved me in more ways than you will ever know." Her eyes glistened with perfectly timed tears. Then she turned to her new in-laws. "And to my new parents, Beverly and Richard. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me into your incredible family, and for showing me what's possible when you refuse to settle for anything less than the best." The line landed, and I felt a dull thud in my chest. It was a carefully chosen phrase, a subtle jab at the life of settling she believed she had escaped. The Sterlings beamed, accepting the compliment as their due. Her gaze then swept the room until it landed on me. The atmosphere shifted. A different kind of silence fell, one filled with anticipation and a hint of morbid curiosity. Everyone knew our story, or at least the version of it Jessica had written. The story of the brilliant, beautiful girl and her poor, simple father. "And of course," she said, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second, "I have to thank my own father." She paused, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air. "My dad. He's here tonight." She pointed me out, and a few heads turned their faces, a mixture of pity and polite interest. "Growing up," she continued, her voice taking on a tone of patronizing nostalgia, "we didn't have much. My father is a very simple man with simple dreams. He taught me a lot. He taught me resilience. He taught me what it's like to make do, to live with less, to always want something more than what you have." It was a backhanded compliment, a way of framing her own ambition as a heroic escape from the prison of my mediocrity. A few people nodded, buying into the narrative completely. She took a breath, preparing for her final act. Her eyes locked on mine, and for the first time that night, there was no filter. I saw the raw, unvarnished resentment she had harbored for years. "He is a good man," she declared to the room, "with a good heart. But as a provider, as a role model for ambition, he taught me exactly what I didn't want my life to be." The air in the room became thin, heavy. You could hear a fork scrape against a plate in the back. "My father," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, enunciating each word with surgical precision, "is a pathetic failure, broke and stuck in the past." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. It was a quiet sound, but it was unmistakable. A few of Chad's younger, crueler friends snickered into their napkins. Most of the older guests stared down at their pristine white tablecloths, their faces frozen in masks of profound discomfort. I saw a woman at a nearby table shake her head slowly, a look of genuine pity in her eyes. It was worse than scorn. It was the look you give something broken and beyond repair. But Jessica wasn't finished. The final twist of the knife was yet to come. She raised her hands, a gesture of magnanimous forgiveness. "But that's okay, Dad," she said, her voice now dripping with a false saccharine sweetness. It was the voice of a saint comforting a sinner. "That part of our lives is over now. You don't have to worry anymore. You don't have to struggle." She smiled brightly at Chad, who smirked back at her, a look of smug victory on his face. "Chad and I will take care of you," she announced. She had just publicly declared me her dependent, her charity case. She raised her champagne flute high. "To new beginnings," she cried out. The applause that followed was weak, scattered, and died out almost as soon as it began. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. Every eye in the room was on me, waiting for me to crumble, to cry, to flee in shame. But I did none of those things. I simply sat there. I felt the heat of 280 pairs of eyes on my skin, but inside a strange and terrible calm had settled over me. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane. The world seemed to slow down. The distant chatter faded into a low hum. In that moment, something inside me broke, but it wasn't my spirit. It was the last frayed thread of hope I had held for the daughter I once knew. It snapped, and in its place something cold, hard, and unbreakable formed. It was clarity. Pure, absolute clarity. I looked down at my hands resting on the white linen. They were a retired teacher's hands, not a CEO's. They were steady. Not a single tremor. I didn't look at Jessica. I didn't look at Chad. I didn't need to see their faces. I had all the evidence I needed. Her final words, "Chad and I will take care of you," echoed in my mind. It was not an offer of help. It was a declaration of ownership, a final assertion of her power over me. And it was the last mistake she would ever make. The applause died. A thick, suffocating silence descended upon the ballroom. It was a silence filled with 280 different flavors of discomfort. There was pity in the eyes of the older guests. There was a cruel, smug amusement on the faces of Chad's friends. And from my daughter Jessica, there was a look of triumphant finality. She had delivered her verdict, and now she was waiting for me to accept my sentence. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the old man to break. They were waiting for tears. They were waiting for a shaking voice, a bowed head, a humiliating retreat from the battlefield she had created. They were waiting for the pathetic failure to play his part. But the tears did not come. The anger did not rise. In the hollow space where a father's heart should have been shattering, something else was taking shape. It was a cold, quiet resolve as hard and clear as a diamond. The pain was immense, a physical weight in my chest, but it was not a destructive force. It was fuel. I looked past Jessica, past the glittering chandeliers and the mocking faces, to an empty space near the dance floor. For a fleeting moment, I could almost see her standing there. My Clara. And a single silent thought echoed in the chambers of my grieving heart. Clara, you knew. You always knew. The memory was as vivid as if it were yesterday. A quiet evening years ago, after Jessica had thrown a tantrum over not getting the brand new convertible her friend had received for her 16th birthday. Clara had been sitting in her favorite armchair, a book open on her lap, her face etched with a sadness that went deeper than the immediate argument. "She has a hole in her heart, Bob," Clara had said, her voice barely a whisper. "And she thinks she can fill it with things. I'm so afraid that one day she'll try to fill it by emptying out everyone around her, even you." I had dismissed it then as a mother's worry. Now, sitting in the wreckage of my public humiliation, I understood. It wasn't a worry. It was a prophecy. and my wise, wonderful Clara had not left me unprepared. I placed my hands palms down on the crisp white linen of the tablecloth. The fabric was cool and smooth beneath my skin. I felt the slight tremor in my fingers, the only sign of the earthquake happening inside me, and I willed them to be still. Then slowly, I pushed my chair back. The sound of its legs scraping against the polished marble floor was unnaturally loud in the silent room. It was the sound of a gear shifting of a great machine beginning to move. I stood up. My legs felt steady. My back was straight. I buttoned the single button on my old suit jacket, a small, deliberate gesture of composure. I could feel the collective gaze of the room on me, a physical pressure. The whispers started then, a low hiss spreading through the crowd, like fire through dry grass. What is he doing? Oh, this is going to be a disaster. Someone should stop him. I took my first step. My destination was the stage, the scene of the crime. I didn't rush. My pace was measured even. The sound of my leather-soled shoes echoed with a steady, rhythmic beat. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a heart that was no longer breaking. It was the sound of a mission beginning. The faces of the guests turned into a blur of pale, curious ovals. The opulent floral arrangements, the towering wedding cake, the glittering ice sculptures, it all faded into an indistinct background. My entire world had narrowed to the 20 yards of pristine white carpet between my table and the 2 small steps leading up to the stage. With every step, I felt the years of quiet sacrifice, the endless nights worrying about Jessica, the profound loneliness after Clara's passing, all of it coalescing not into weakness, but into an unshakable strength. I was no longer a victim in their story. I was the author of the final chapter. I reached the stage. I ascended the 2 steps without faltering. I was now standing at the very lectern where my daughter had so casually dismantled my dignity. The MC, a nervous young man in a tuxedo, started to move towards me, a placating smile plastered on his face. "Sir, perhaps we should continue with the—" I simply held up a hand, a gesture not of anger, but of absolute authority. He stopped dead in his tracks. From the head table, Jessica was on her feet, her face a mask of incandescent fury. "Dad, sit down!" She hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that carried across the first few tables. "You are making a fool of yourself. Don't you dare ruin my day." Chad stood beside her, his hand on her arm, his face dark with menace. He looked at me as if I were a piece of trash he was about to have thrown out. I ignored them. I didn't even grant them a glance. My focus was elsewhere. They expected me to reach for the microphone to offer a rambling, emotional defense. They expected a plea for sympathy. I did not. Instead, my right hand moved to the inside pocket of my suit jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate, every eye in the room following it. I reached inside and pulled out not a crumpled speech, but a small black object that seemed to absorb the light in the room. It was a simple USB flash drive. I held it between my thumb and forefinger. Engraved on its metallic casing were 2 small, elegant initials. C.V. Clara Vance. I held it up just enough for it to be seen. It was a small, insignificant thing, yet in that moment it felt heavier than a stone. The sight of it was a complete mystery, an action that did not compute with the scene they had all been expecting. A new kind of silence fell upon the room, a silence no longer filled with pity, but with a sharp, sudden, and profound curiosity. The question hanging in the air was no longer, "What will the old man say?" It was, "What in God's name is on that drive?" I stood on the stage, the small USB drive held firmly between my thumb and forefinger. It was the focal point of the entire ballroom. The DJ, a young man in his early 20s, with meticulously styled hair and a look of rising panic in his eyes, stared at the drive as if it were a live grenade. He was trapped, caught between the fury of the clients who were paying him and the unnerving calm of the old man who had hijacked their wedding. "Sir," the DJ began, his voice wavering slightly. He kept glancing over my shoulder towards the head table where Jessica and Chad were now both on their feet. Sir, I have a schedule to keep. We have the cake-cutting ceremony next. He was looking for an escape, a way to appeal to procedure and decorum. I took a single step closer to his console, invading his personal space just enough to make him uncomfortable. I didn't raise my voice. I kept it low, steady, and devoid of any emotion except absolute certainty. "Young man," I said, my eyes locked on his, "you are going to take this drive. You are going to plug it into your laptop, and you are going to play the video file named For Jessica's Wedding. This is not a request." His eyes widened. He licked his lips nervously, his professional composure crumbling. I can't do that, sir. My instructions from Mr. Sterling were very clear." "Were your instructions to stand by while a father was publicly humiliated by his own child?" The question hung in the air between us. It was a low blow, and I knew it. But I also knew I had to break through his wall of professional detachment. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not pity, but conflict. He was a kid trying to do his job, and he had just been dragged into the middle of a war he didn't understand. That was when Chad decided to take matters into his own hands. "Security!" he bellowed, his voice raw with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Get this old fool off the stage now!" He started storming towards the stage himself, his expensive suit jacket bunched up around his shoulders, his face a blotchy, furious red. He looked like a spoiled child about to throw a tantrum. The two event coordinators, a man and a woman in black suits, started moving hesitantly from the sides of the room. But they were too slow. Before Chad could reach the steps of the stage, a large figure moved to intercept him. It was my cousin Leo, a man I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. He was a big man, a carpenter by trade, with hands like worn leather, and a quiet, unassuming presence. He had been seated at a table in the back, but he had seen everything. He simply stepped into Chad's path, a solid, immovable object. He didn't say a word at first, just stood there, blocking the way. "Get out of my way," Chad snarled, trying to push past him. Leo didn't budge. He looked down at Chad, who was a good 4 inches shorter and 100 pounds lighter, and spoke in a low, rumbling voice that carried in the tense silence. "The man has something to say, son. You're going to stand here and listen." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. Chad, for the first time in what was probably a very long and privileged life, was stopped cold. He was confronted by a type of power that money couldn't buy and status couldn't intimidate. He stood there seething with impotent rage, completely outmaneuvered. That single act of defiance was all it took. It broke the spell. The DJ looked from the neutralized Chad to the resolute face of my cousin Leo, and then back to me. He saw that I was not just a crazy old man. I had an ally. He made his decision. With a deep breath and a quick apologetic nod, he took the USB drive from my hand. His fingers brushed against mine, and I felt a slight tremor in them. The entire ballroom was now silent as a tomb. Every single guest was on their feet, their dinner forgotten, their wine untouched. They were no longer wedding guests. They were spectators at a gladiatorial arena waiting for the final bloody blow. Jessica stood frozen by her chair, her face pale, her mouth slightly open in a mask of dawning horror. She was finally realizing that she had lost control of her perfectly orchestrated day. The DJ turned back to his glowing laptop screen. I heard the soft, distinct click as he slid the USB drive into its port. On the 3 giant projection screens that flanked the stage, the looping slideshow of Jessica and Chad's laughing, smiling engagement photos abruptly stopped. The screens went black. For a heart-stopping second, the room was plunged into a strange, expectant twilight. Then a single line of white text appeared on the black screens. Loading file for Jessica's wedding.mp4. The progress bar began to fill. The show was about to begin. The blackness on the 3 giant screens held for a heartbeat longer than was comfortable, a void that swallowed all the light and sound in the grand ballroom. Then they flickered to life. The image that resolved was not of a spreadsheet or a legal document. It was of a woman, my wife, Clara. She was sitting in her favorite armchair, the one with the worn floral pattern in the living room of our small, quiet home. The afternoon sun streamed in from the window behind her, creating a soft, hazy halo around her. She was thinner than I had allowed myself to remember the illness having carved away at her, but her eyes were the same. They were bright and clear and filled with a light that no sickness could ever extinguish. She smiled a gentle, tired but genuinely loving smile. The entire room seemed to lean in, captivated. Her voice filled the ballroom, not through the DJ's booming speakers, but as if she were whispering to each person individually. It was weaker than I remembered, raspy with fatigue, but it was her voice. It was the voice that had been the soundtrack to my entire adult life. "Hello, my darling Jessica," she began, her eyes looking directly into the camera, as if she could see our daughter across time and space. "If you are watching this, it means today is your wedding day, and it means I am not there to see it." Her voice cracked, just for a moment, a single painful note of regret. "I am so sorry for that, my love, more than you will ever know. There is nothing in this world I wanted more than to be there today, to fix your veil, to hold your hand, and to tell you how beautiful you look." I watched Jessica's face. The hard, angry mask she had been wearing began to soften, replaced by a look of stunned confusion. This was not the attack she had been bracing for. This was an embrace from the past. Clara continued, her smile returning. "I remember when you were about 6 years old. You spent an entire afternoon sitting on this very floor with a big box of crayons drawing your dream wedding dress. Do you remember that?" A soft, nostalgic look came over Clara's face. "It was the most magnificent dress I had ever seen. It was bright pink with huge purple sleeves, a rainbow-colored train, and a veil that was covered in what you told me were diamond stars. You were so proud of that drawing. You made your father hang it on the refrigerator for a whole year." A few of the older women in the audience, friends of my late wife, let out soft, sad sighs. They were remembering the little girl, not the cold woman, standing at the head table. "I still have that drawing, you know," Clara said, her voice warm. "It's tucked away in my memory box. To me, it's more precious than any designer gown because you made it. It was a piece of your heart, a piece of your joy." She shifted slightly in her chair, a movement that I knew cost her a great deal of energy. "And I remember the thunderstorms. You were always so terrified of them. You'd come running into our room, your little face pale, and you'd crawl into bed between your father and me. You would hide your head under the covers, and your dad, he would make up the most wonderful stories for you. Stories about a brave princess named Jessica, who wasn't afraid of anything, who could command the thunder and ride the lightning. He would tell those stories until you fell asleep safe between us." She looked away from the camera for a moment, her gaze turning inward to a place only she could see. "Your father and I, we would just look at each other over your sleeping head, and we wouldn't have to say a word. We knew. We knew we had the most wonderful, brilliant, and spirited daughter in the entire world. I was always so proud of you, Jessie. Not for your grades or your accomplishments, but for the fire inside you." Finally, her eyes returned to the camera, and it felt as if she were looking right into my soul. "We were a family, a small, simple, and imperfect family. But we were happy. We had love, and I hoped that would be enough." I looked over at my daughter. Her face was a storm of conflicting emotions. The loving words from her mother, the woman she still claimed to adore, were a direct contradiction to the narrative of suffering and lack she had just painted for everyone. Clara's message wasn't an attack. It was a gentle, loving reminder of a truth Jessica had tried to bury. The room was silent, wrapped in the warmth of my wife's memory. The ambush was complete. They were disarmed. They were vulnerable. and they had no idea what was coming next. The warm, nostalgic glow of my wife's memory held the room in a gentle trance. The guests were moved, saddened, remembering the loving mother and the happy childhood. My daughter Jessica stood by her table, her hard facade softened by the unexpected wave of affection from the past. For a moment, a fragile peace settled over the ballroom. And then, on the screen, Clara took a slow, deliberate breath, and everything changed. Her soft, reminiscent smile faded. It was replaced by a look of quiet seriousness, a look I knew well. It was the look she got when she was about to speak an undeniable and often difficult truth. The loving mother was still there, but now she was also the clear-eyed matriarch preparing to set the record straight. "Jessica," she said, her voice losing its gentle, hazy quality and becoming clear and focused. "I know that growing up you often felt that we didn't have enough. You saw your friends with their new cars and designer clothes, and you looked at our simple life at your father and me, and you thought we were content with too little. You believed our life was a cage you needed to escape from." Every word was a precise surgical cut, dissecting the very foundation of Jessica's resentment. I could see my daughter flinch, a small, almost imperceptible movement. This was getting too close to the bone. Clara continued, her gaze unwavering. "There are things we never told you. Not because we wanted to lie, but because we wanted to protect you. We wanted you to build a life based on your own merits, not on an expectation of wealth. What you never knew, my darling, is that when your grandmother, my mother, passed away, she left me her entire estate. It wasn't a vast fortune like the Sterlings have, but it was a significant amount of money. Enough to change our lives completely." A low murmur rippled through the room. Richard and Beverly Sterling exchanged a quick, curious glance. This was new information. This was a deviation from the established script of the poor teacher. "But we decided not to change our lives," Clara said, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "Because your father, your brilliant, humble, and endlessly patient father, saw it not as money to be spent, but as a seed to be planted." She looked down for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "He spent 6 months every night after he finished grading papers researching. He wasn't looking at the stock market. He was talking to a former student of his, a brilliant young woman who was starting a small, unknown biotechnology company. Everyone said it was a foolish risk. Our financial advisor told us to put the money in safe, boring bonds. But your father, the science teacher, he understood the potential. He believed in the science." She looked back up, her eyes finding the camera lens again, and it felt as though she was looking directly at Chad, at Richard Sterling, at every person in that room who had ever dismissed me. "So he took every single penny of that inheritance, and he invested it." She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle into the silent room. "He never told you about it, Jessica, because he never wanted you to grow up defined by money. He wanted you to be defined by your character. He wanted this to be a safety net for your future, not a crutch for your present. He wanted you to learn the value of work, of kindness, of respect." As she spoke these last words, the image on the screen began to change. Her face gently faded, replaced by a document. It was a crisp, professional financial statement, the logo of the investment firm Morgan Stanley clearly visible at the top. The account name was printed in bold letters, the Vance Family Trust. Below it were lines of financial data complex and indecipherable to most. But at the very bottom, highlighted in a yellow box, was one line: total portfolio value. And next to it, a number so large, so impossible, that it seemed to vibrate on the 3 giant screens. $38, $247, $591.34. The sound the room made was not a gasp. It was a sharp collective intake of breath, a whoosh of displaced air, as if every lung in the ballroom had emptied and refilled at the exact same moment. A fork clattered loudly onto a china plate, the noise as jarring as a gunshot. I looked at Chad. The smug, condescending smirk that had been his default expression all night was gone, wiped clean from his face. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide, flicking frantically from the screen to me and back to the screen again. He was a man of finance. He understood what that number meant, but his brain could not reconcile that number with the man he had dismissed as a broke, pathetic failure. The circuits were overloaded. He was shorting out. And then I looked at my daughter. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving behind a pallid, waxy sheen. Her perfectly applied lipstick stood out like a gash of red on a bloodless canvas. Her mouth opened, then closed like a fish gasping for air. No sound came out. This wasn't just shock. It was the sound of a world collapsing. The entire narrative of her life, the carefully constructed story of her heroic escape from a humble, impoverished background, had just been publicly, spectacularly, and irrefutably detonated. In front of all the people she had worked so hard to impress, she had been exposed not as a survivor, but as a fool. She finally turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes were wide with a dazed, uncomprehending horror. It was the look of a driver who has just realized they have steered their life off a cliff. The impossible number $38,247,591.34 hung in the air, glowing on the 3 giant screens. It felt less like a number and more like a judgment. The stunned silence in the ballroom was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. They were all transfixed, their minds reeling, trying to reconcile the image of the poor, pathetic father with the reality of this colossal fortune. On the screen, the financial statement gently faded away, and Clara's face returned. But her expression had changed again. The warm nostalgia was gone, and the serious look of revelation had now softened into something else entirely. It was a look of profound maternal resolve. It was the look she used to have when she was about to teach Jessica a difficult but necessary life lesson. It was the look of a mother who was about to save her child, whether the child wanted to be saved or not. "I know this number is a lot to take in, Jessica," Clara said, her voice calm and measured. "But money is not a gift. It is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used to build a beautiful, meaningful life, or it can be used as a weapon to destroy one." She let that thought hang in the air for a moment. "Your father and I, we gave you everything we could. We gave you our time, our love, our unwavering support. But in our desire to give you a better life than we had, we failed to give you the one thing you needed most, a true understanding of value. This is my final gift to you, Jessica. This is my attempt to correct that failure." As she spoke, the image on the screen split. Clara remained on the left side, while on the right text began to appear in a simple, clear, legal-style font, as if typed by an unseen hand. "This money," Clara explained, "is held in the Clara Vance Legacy Trust. Your father, Robert Vance, is the sole executor of this trust. His judgment in all matters is final. And Jessica, my love, in order for you to become the beneficiary and access any part of these funds, you must first meet a series of non-negotiable conditions." The first condition appeared on the screen. Condition 1, proof of labor. "First," Clara said, her voice firm, "you must learn the dignity of earning a living for yourself. You will be required to find and maintain a full-time job with no financial assistance from the Sterling family or any of its associates. You must hold this job for 5 consecutive years. Proof of employment, including tax returns and performance reviews, must be submitted to the executor of the trust annually for verification." I watched Jessica's face. The shock had begun to curdle into a look of disbelief and horror. 5 years. To a woman who had never worked a day in her life, it must have sounded like a life sentence in a labor camp. The text on the screen changed. Condition 2. Proof of compassion. Clara's voice softened, but lost none of its resolve. "Second, you must learn the value of compassion. You must understand that a person's worth is not measured by what they have, but by what they give to those who have nothing. You will be required to complete 1,000 hours of documented volunteer service. She paused, and her next words were delivered with pinpoint precision. You will complete this service at the Northwood Hospice Center, the same facility where I spent my final days. A small, choked sound escaped Jessica's lips. I saw her physically recoil as if struck. Clara was forcing her to walk the very halls where her mother had faded away, to face the raw, unvarnished reality of life and death that her new wealthy world was designed to ignore. The text changed again. Condition 3. Proof of wisdom. And finally, Clara said, her gaze seeming to encompass both Jessica and Chad. You must learn the wisdom of managing both money and a true partnership. You and your husband will be required to attend 1 year of mandatory financial counseling with a certified planner and 1 year of mandatory couples therapy with a licensed psychologist. Certified reports of your full attendance and participation must be submitted to the executor. I glanced at Chad. His face had hardened into a mask of cold fury. This was no longer just about Jessica's inheritance. This was an indictment of him, of their relationship, of the very foundation of their materialistic union. His world was being invaded. His choices questioned his authority, undermined by a ghost on a screen. Clara's image once again filled the entire screen. These are my terms, Jessica, she said gently. This is not a punishment. It is a roadmap. It is a path back to the wonderful, smart, and kind-hearted girl I know is still inside you. The girl your father and I raised. The stunned silence of the guests had now transformed into a kind of awestruck reverence. They were witnessing the most incredible act of posthumous parenting they had ever seen. The shock of the money was now completely overshadowed by the shock of the conditions attached to it. This was not a lottery win. This was a challenge. An epic, life-altering quest designed by a mother who loved her daughter enough to force her to become a better person. Jessica and Chad stood frozen, the magnitude of the situation finally crashing down on them. The $38 million dream had in an instant become a nightmare of responsibility work and introspection. Everything their lives had been structured to avoid. And on the screen, Clara took one final gentle breath, her face a mixture of love and profound sorrow. She knew she had one more thing to say, the most difficult thing of all. On the screen, my wife's image remained a silent, loving ghost, presiding over the wreckage of her daughter's wedding. Jessica and Chad stood frozen, the list of ironclad conditions hanging in the air, like a death sentence for the life they had planned. The guests were motionless, witnessing a family drama more raw and real than anything they had ever seen. The room was a pressure cooker of shock and suspense, and then Clara on the screen took one last soft breath, her expression shifting for a final time. The look of a firm, guiding mother softened into something infinitely more profound. It was a look of deep, sorrowful love, the look of a person about to say a final, heartbreaking goodbye. Jessica, she said, and my daughter's name on her lips was a soft, gentle caress. My sweet girl, look at your father. Though she was speaking to Jessica, it felt like she was commanding the entire room to turn their attention to me. I want you to really look at him. Clara's eyes, even on the video, seemed to well up with tears, but her voice remained steady, filled with a strength that defied her illness. That man, your father, for the 4 years that I was sick, he never left my side. He held my hand through every chemotherapy session. He learned how to cook my favorite meals for the days I had an appetite, and he held me when I was too weak to eat. He worked a second job, a night shift cleaning offices downtown, to pay for the experimental medicines the insurance company refused to cover. He read to me for hours when my eyes were too tired to focus. In all that time, in all that pain and exhaustion, I never heard him complain. Not once. A quiet sob broke the silence in the room. It came from one of Clara's old friends, a woman who knew that every word of this was the absolute truth. Clara's voice grew stronger, imbued with a fierce, protective love. This money is my family's legacy, Jessica. But your father, he is my heart. and a legacy is worthless if the heart is not protected. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense, seeming to burn through the screen. That is why I created one final condition, a fail-safe. It is my last line of defense, not for the money, but for him, for his dignity. The image on the screen changed one last time. All the previous text vanished, replaced by two words written in a stark, bold, and blood-red font. Clause 7b. I have instructed your father. Clara said, her voice now as solemn as a judge's verdict, as the sole and undisputed executor of my will, that if he ever for any reason feels that you have treated him with profound disrespect, if you ever make him feel small or worthless or unloved, if you ever forget the sacrifices he made not just for me, but for you, he has my full, unconditional, and legally binding permission to enact Clause 7b. She did not explain what the clause was. She left that terrible knowledge hanging in the air, a sword suspended by a single thread. Her face softened again, for the last time, her love for her lost daughter, pouring through the screen in a final heartbreaking wave. I love you, Jessica. Always. Please, please become the woman I know you can be. And then nothing. The video didn't fade to black. It just cut. One moment she was there, and the next the three giant screens were black, silent voids reflecting the stunned, pale faces of the wedding guests. The abruptness of it was a shock to the system. The connection was severed. The ghost was gone. And all that was left was a heavy electric silence, thick with one terrifying unanswered question. The video was over. The three giant black screens were now just dark mirrors reflecting a scene of utter devastation. My wife's voice was gone, but her presence lingered, a powerful, undeniable force that had completely rewritten the reality of the room. The silence was no longer the absence of sound. It was a living thing, thick with the weight of an unanswered question. Every eye in that ballroom, from the shocked guests to the terrified waitstaff, turned from the blank screens to me. They were no longer looking at a pathetic old man. They were looking at an executioner, and they were all waiting to hear the sentence. I walked the few steps from where I was standing to the lectern at the center of the stage. My movements felt strangely light, as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders after years of carrying it. I reached for the microphone, my hand steady, my fingers wrapping around the cool metal. I switched it on. A soft electronic pop echoed through the silent ballroom, a sound as final and definitive as a judge's gavel. I looked out at the sea of stunned faces, but my gaze settled on just one. My daughter, Jessica. She was staring at me, her face a pale, frozen mask of disbelief. The last vestiges of her pride and arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind a raw, desperate fear. Clause 7b, I said. My voice was quiet, but the microphone carried it to every corner of the room. It was my voice, but it sounded different, calmer, stronger. It was the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to fear. My wife Clara, I continued, believed that money could not fix a problem of character. She knew that a fortune given to someone without wisdom or compassion would not be a blessing. It would be a curse. She believed that true wealth was not measured in dollars, but in kindness, in decency, and in respect. Clause 7b was never about protecting the money. It was about protecting the values that the money was meant to serve. It was her last hope that our daughter would learn that lesson. I let my words sink in, let the room absorb the moral weight of what Clara had done. Then I explained the mechanics of it. The clause is very simple. It states that if the trust's sole executor, that is me, deems that the primary beneficiary, that is you, Jessica, has failed to show a basic fundamental level of human decency and respect towards her family, then the executor has the right and the legal obligation to dissolve the beneficiary's claim, completely and irrevocably. I paused, and then I connected the past to the present, the crime to the punishment. When you stood up here on this very stage in front of 280 people and called me a pathetic failure, when you dismissed a lifetime of my love and sacrifice as a humble beginning you needed to be rescued from, you weren't just being cruel, Jessica. You were making a choice. You were giving testimony. You were providing irrefutable evidence against yourself. I looked directly at her, and for the first time I think she truly saw me. She saw the man her mother loved, the man whose heart she had just broken for the last time. You were demonstrating in the clearest possible terms that you had failed to meet the most important condition of your mother's will. The condition that came before all the others. The condition of being a good person. A low guttural sound, a half-sob, half-gasp, escaped her throat. The horrifying truth was beginning to dawn on her. So the other conditions, I said, my voice flat, stating a simple fact. The 5 years of work, the 1,000 hours of volunteering, the counseling, they are no longer on the table. They were a path to redemption, a path that is now closed. You are no longer eligible to even attempt them. The finality of those words hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't just the money that was gone. It was the chance, the hope, the possibility of ever earning her mother's legacy was gone, and it was her own words, her own cruelty, that had vaporized it. I looked at my daughter, at the ruins of the life she thought she had secured. The shock on her face had finally given way to a desperate, pleading expression. Her eyes, for the first time in years, were begging me for something, for mercy, for a way out. For me to say that this was all some horrible, cruel test. But I had no mercy left to give. She had scraped it all away year after year with 1,000 tiny cuts of disrespect, culminating in tonight's brutal public execution of my character. Her mother's words, her mother's last hope for her, had been laid out as a clear and simple path. A path Jessica had not just strayed from, but had actively set on fire. I leaned slightly closer to the microphone, my voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it carried the weight of a final judgment to every corner of the silent room. I wasn't speaking to the crowd anymore. I was speaking only to her, a final epitaph for the relationship we once had. "Your speech, Jessica," I said, pausing to let the memory of her own cruel words fill the space between us. I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes as she was forced to remember what she had said, what she had done. It was truly memorable. I said the words without anger, without bitterness, without any emotion at all. It was a flat statement of fact. Her speech was the evidence. Her speech was the testimony. And her speech was the reason this was all coming to an end. It was indeed the most memorable speech I had ever heard, and it would be the last. I said the final words, and the weight of them seemed to suck all the remaining air out of the ballroom. The truth in all its brutal simplicity had been delivered. My part was done. I gently placed the microphone back into its stand. The small click it made was the sound of a book being closed, a final chapter finished. Without another glance at my daughter or her new husband, I turned my back on the stage. I turned my back on the wreckage. I started to walk. As I descended the small steps, a sound finally broke the spell of silence. It was the sound of my daughter Jessica finally breaking. It wasn't a loud wail, but a sharp, ragged, ugly sob of pure, undiluted loss. It was the sound of a spoiled child who had just had her favorite toy not just taken away, but vaporized before her very eyes. Then came another voice, Chad's low and guttural, laced with a venom that was no longer directed at me. "You idiot!" he snarled at his new bride. "You sentimental, useless idiot! You had $38 million in your hand, and you threw it all away for a speech." I didn't need to look back. I could already see the scene in my mind. The beginning of their end. The foundation of their marriage, built on a bedrock of greed and ambition, had just crumbled into dust. They were now trapped in the ruins together. I kept walking, my pace steady. I walked past the stunned faces of the guests, past the tables laden with food that would not be eaten, past the towering cake that would not be cut. I pushed open the grand oak doors of the ballroom and stepped out into the cool, quiet air of the evening. The night was peaceful. The sky was clear, dotted with 1,000 indifferent stars. The frantic, ugly drama I had left behind felt a world away. I walked across the manicured parking lot, my simple leather shoes crunching softly on the gravel, until I reached my car. A 10-year-old Ford sedan, impeccably maintained. It was humble. It was reliable. It was mine. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, shutting out the last faint echoes of the disaster inside. The silence in the car was a balm, a welcome relief. For a moment, I just sat there, my hands on the steering wheel, breathing. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small, worn, dark blue velvet box. I opened it. Inside, Clara's gold locket seemed to glow in the faint light from the dashboard. The gift my daughter had deemed too old, too worthless to wear. I didn't put it on. I simply reached over and placed the open box gently on the empty passenger seat beside me. It was as if I were placing a hand on an old friend's shoulder. She was with me. Her memory, her love, her strength. That was my fortune. That had always been my fortune. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine started with a familiar, comforting hum. I pulled out of the parking space and without a single glance in the rearview mirror, I drove away from the Greystone Country Club, leaving the wreckage of a multi-million-dollar wedding behind me. I wasn't just leaving a party. I was driving toward a future of peace, a future of freedom, a future where my own dignity had finally been restored. This story teaches a powerful lesson about the true nature of wealth. It's not found in a $38 million bank account, but in the quiet dignity of a father's love and the lasting wisdom of a mother's foresight. It reminds us that respect, kindness, and decency are the most valuable currencies we possess. The world may judge you by the car you drive or the house you own, but your true character is revealed in how you treat the people who sacrificed to give you everything. True poverty isn't having an empty wallet. It's having an empty heart. Have you ever seen someone's true character revealed when money was on the line? Share your thoughts in the comments below.